Hello, loyal fans and subscribers to Larissa Rowan, Moon Woman. So, guess what I found? I finally found again, well, I came across it in a storage unit. Moon of the. Oh, wait. Daughters of the Moon. I was reading it backwards. Uh, Into the Cold Fire. So, from my recollection, and if you are really a devoted fan of finishing a complete series in say, a school library and stuff, this is on the house, okay? But if you ever cross my path, give me, like, give me some change for a pop and share it. If I can go instead of coffee, let's go have a pop. Anyways, Daughters of the Moon, Into the Cold Fire. So since, like, some people like me who live with OCD, uh, I'm just doing you guys like a solid here because I know what it's like to have OCD, and yeah, to help process your life and continue forth with it, I'm gonna just read this on the house, okay? For Laura Brooks, meme Miribly Mar Miribly Miribilum Consorbium Consobrinum Consobrinum. Okay. Mium Miribilium Consobrinum Consobrinum Consobrinum. Okay, that sounds better. Many thanks to Victor Carlo Jr., Angela Hayden, Nadia Marquez, Julie Morales, Ivania Sandoval, and Mike Terrell for sharing a small part of their lives with me. And a special thank you to my wonderful editor, Alessandra Balzer. Belzois is how you really pronounce it. Prologue. In antiquity, Hecate was loved and revered as the goddess of the dark moon. People looked at her as a guardian against unseen dangers and spiritual foes. All was well until Persephone, the goddess of spring, was kidnapped by Hades and ordered to live in the underworld for 3 months each year. Persephone was afraid to make the journey down to the land of the dead alone. So, year after year, Hecate lovingly guided her through the dark passageway and back. Over time, Hecate became known as Persephone's attendant. But because Persephone was also the queen of the lower world, who ruled over the dead with her husband, Hades. Oh. Hecate's role as a guardian goddess soon became twisted and distorted until she was known as the evil witch goddess who stalked the night looking for the innocent people to bewitch and carry off to the underworld. Today, few know the great goddess Hecate. Those who do are blessed with her compassion for a soul lost in a realm of evil. Some are given a key. Chapter 1. So that was a prologue. Chapter 1. Serena Killingsworth stood on the shoulder of Pacific Coast Highway near the bluffs, waiting for her surf rat brother to pull his surfboard from the back of the utility van. She stared out at the gray-green water and breathed in the briny smell of sea and kelp. Overhead, seagulls circled with their shuddering "Kias." Awesome. Colin said behind her, "The waves are really pumped up." Her thoughts had been on something more deadly than surf. Still, she smiled when she turned to her brother. "Great set," she agreed. Colin pulled his wetsuit from the back of the van and snapped it into place. He was such a bored head that he ignored warnings about surfing alone, especially at night. Serena didn't question his swimming. He was strong. It wasn't riptide sharks or wipeouts that made her fear for his safety. She knew of other things that made Los Angeles night per, 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 per Lewis. Per Lewis. Per, yeah. Paralysis. There we go. Paralysis. I'm going to start that sentence over. She knew of other things that made a Los Angeles night paralysis. And lately, those dangers had become more menacing. Aren't you going out? He asked, and motioned with his head to her board. No, she said, and tied her sweatshirt around her waist. She wore a long-sleeved bathing suit. She had planned to go out, but that was before something had happened at school. Now she needed time to think. He said, I'll wait on the beach. A wind blew at the incoming waves, holding them up and making them more hollow. Perfect for surfing. It's classic, he said. You sure? Sure. Wait, it's classic. I'm not going to do the voices, okay? Do it in your head, okay? It's classic, he said. You sure? Sure. The setting sun speckled his crystal blue eyes with flecks of light and colored his long, white blonde hair fiery gold. Nothing about the two of them looked familiar. Her hair was dark, the roots almost black, the tips Crayola red. Pointy black shades hid her green eyes. And her tan was even darker than his because she loved the sun and hated the sticky feel of sunblock. So, Colin said, and pulled out his board. How was school today? She stiffened. Well, he threw down a towel and set his board on top. She felt ambushed. I guess you know already, or you wouldn't be asking. There was no way he could know what had happened unless Morgan Page had told him. Morgan had a crush on Colin and used Serena as an excuse to talk to him. You're getting a flaky reputation, Colin warned. He grabbed a chunk of paraffin from the back of the van, got down on his knees, and started rubbing a thin layer of wax on a deck of the board. Serena tried to swallow her anger. If he knew the facts, he wouldn't question her. She smiled to herself and fantasized about telling Colin what her true identity was. She imagined the surprised look on his face, what he would feel proud of her or frightened. For sure, he would never look at his younger sister the same way again. It's not funny, he said, as if he could sense her smiling. Her daydream slid away. What did Morgan tell you? He stopped waxing the board and gazed up at her. A strange look crossed his face. Immediately, she realized she had made a mistake. I never said it was Morgan. Then his face relaxed and he chuckled. You always know how to read my mind. She breathed out. No need to panic this time. He'd gotten used to the way she sometimes knew what he was thinking. He thought it was because they had become so close after their mother left them. If he only knew. It was easy to guess, she said simply. Morgan exaggerates so she'll have an excuse to call you. He stood and threw the wax into the back of the van with a loud thump. Thump. Did she say that? A sly smile crept across his face. No, Serena responded. Then she caught the puppy dog look in his eyes and whispered a quick prayer. Please, no. Things were already difficult enough without adding Morgan to the mix. It would be a nightmare. Colin liked her. Serena had a mental flash of Morgan hanging out at their house, watching her, following her, nosing around her bedroom. It was bad enough she had to see her at school every day. Morgan seemed to suspect that something about Serena and her three best friends, Jamina, Caddy, and Vanessa, was different. She had no idea how different they actually were. Still, some days she snooped disturbingly close to the truth. She sighed. You'd like to go out with her, wouldn't you? No, he spoke too quickly. She didn't need to be a mind reader to know that was a lie. Yes, you would, she pointed out matter-of-factly. I'm just going to meet her for coffee. He took a thin plastic blade with a serrated edge and scored grooves into the wax of his board. What's wrong with that? She asked you to meet her to talk about me, didn't she? Like she wants help. How do you know that? He tossed the wax comb into the van and slammed the cargo door. I know Morgan. I thought you did too. Did you forget? You always said she doesn't have boyfriends. She takes prisoners. Serena hated the nag in her voice. Morgan's changed. He was being annoyingly defensive. Not enough, Serena muttered and turned away. She couldn't tell Colin what had really happened to Morgan last month to make her change. He probably wouldn't believe her anyway. Even Morgan didn't understand what had actually been done to her. If she did, she would have been more frightened by those punks this afternoon. Morgan couldn't know how vulnerable she was right now. That was one reason Serena and Jamina had risked exposing themselves in order to protect her. Had Morgan seen them do anything strange this afternoon? She clicked her barbell, tongue pierced nervously against her teeth. Colin started to pick up his board, but stopped. A look of astonishment crossed his face. Had she slipped? Given something away? What? She asked. Your moon amulet. He reached for it. It changed color. She took a quick step back before he could touch it. She looked down at the amulet hanging around her neck and studied the face of the moon etched in the metal. The charm had been given to her at birth. It wasn't pure silver, but sparkling in the light of the setting sun. It cast back a rainbow of shimmering lights. Jamina, Caddy, and Vanessa each had one too. Serena never took hers off. Probably the setting sun? She clasped her hand around it. The amulet resonated, as if an electrical current passed through it. Did that mean one of them had followed her? She looked quickly behind her. Traffic continued down the highway, tires humming. She didn't see anything on that should alert her to danger. She wished Jamina were here. Normally they were inseparable, but this evening Jamina had to do community service at the children's hospital. She worked with children undergoing rehabilitation for gunshot wounds. She read to them, played checkers, and showed them how to macrame. Jamina had been in a gang and sentenced twice to a youth authority camp for jacking cars. She would be there now if a lenient judge hadn't sentenced her to a community service work instead. Jamina had one badass homegirl before she understood her destiny. Their destiny. Colin placed his hand on her shoulder. Here it comes, she thought. She mouthed the words as he spoke behind her. I'm concerned about you. But his next words took her completely by surprise. Maybe if you had a boyfriend. She spun around on him. What? Morgan says that's why you act the way you do. Because you don't have a boyfriend. You never. The last time I tried to have a boyfriend, she scared him away. You were always in his face. She couldn't tell him the real reason if it was so difficult for her to have a boyfriend. He shrugged it off. You're older now. Maybe if you found someone, a guy isn't the answer. Anger burned inside her. She was so annoyed at Morgan that she wanted to explode. But how could she be mad at Colin when she knew how much he worried about her? Colin spoke softly now, sensing her anger. She said she was flirting with these guys, and you and Jamina came up and started talking gibberish. It wasn't gibberish. It wasn't gibberish. It was Latin. Serena snapped and immediately wished she hadn't. Latin? Colin repeated in disbelief. No one speaks Latin. It's a dead language. He looked at her curiously. When did you learn Latin, anyway? Just did. Again, she wished she hadn't mentioned Latin. It was one more secret. She had been born with the ability to speak Latin and ancient Greek. She just hadn't known it until she had learned about her destiny. She sighed. Fuera dia. What does that mean? Ugly goddess. Goddess! He seemed to think that was funny. That upset you? Forget it. She started walking toward the beach. Morgan says kids at school call you the Queen of Bizarre. She whirled around. Morgan, she corrected. Only Morgan calls me the Queen of Bizarre. Everyone else likes me. At least she thought they did. They seemed nice enough to her, all except Morgan, who seemed to have some personal vendetta against her that she didn't understand. Well, it's a little odd you made those guys get away from her, Colin said. It wasn't like Jamina and I didn't have a reason for doing what we did, but Morgan didn't tell you about that, did she? What was it? Those guys were bothering her. I don't know why she told you she was flirting with them. Morgan's never liked hardcore punkers. She likes jocks. She was telling them to get away from her and they wouldn't. I mean, the guys were wearing chains with padlocks and they each had five hoops piercing their lips. Colin gave her an amused look. Okay, I've got piercings, but these guys have faces that look like pincushions, jailhouse tattoos for time spent, and a major attitude. Punkers who speak Latin? He looked doubtful. Why had she mentioned the Latin? Yes, that's not how Morgan described it. Of course not, Serena said with frustration. She wanted an excuse to call you, and she couldn't tell you that Jamina and I rescued her, because then she might look bad. She's lucky Jamina and I were around. Morgan didn't know how lucky. She never had the best judgment about people. Then another thought came to her. What if Morgan had tried to set it up to see what she and Jamina would do? Could she know that much? Colin smiled broadly. So you and Jamina rescued Morgan, chased the bad boys away. He hugged her, and she could smell the neoprene rubber of his wet suit. Cool. My sister and Jamina Castello, sophomore vigilantes of La Breja. I'm going to say it like that. That was closer to the truth. So don't worry about it, she said. But he was already looking back at the ocean. The waves called. Morgan was forgotten. Let's go. He picked up his board and started walking. They slipped through a narrow opening. Put it down. In a fence. She took off her blue sandals and walked down the spongy ice planet that covered the sandy slope, then followed Colin to the shoreline. Sand squeezed through her toes. She kept glancing at her moon amulet. It was no longer glowing. She wondered what it had picked up earlier. At the water's edge, Colin slipped the Velcro strap around his ankle that leashed him to his surfboard. A wave fanned across the sand, and Serena felt the cold water gather around her ankles with a shock. Damn, Colin muttered. She looked at the sets rolling in. Two other surfers rode the waves. Colin liked time alone. Be careful, she said. No fear, he whispered. He hesitated a moment, as if he were uttering a prayer to the great Kahuna, the only true surf god. Then he charged into the waves, slipped the board into the darkening water, slid on top, and paddled over the next wave. She waited in the foam and backwash until he caught his first wave. The setting sun glowed through the wave and silhouetted him. He was phenomenal. Hanging 10 was his specialty. It wasn't easy to do the move. He had to abandon the usual sideways stance that made it easier to control the board. He stood on the tip of the nose, all 10 toes hanging over, knees slightly bent, arms balancing out to his sides. Sometimes crowds gathered and watched his nose riding. She walked along with wet sand over broken clam and cockle shells. The soft roar of surf and the constant hum of traffic on Pacific Coast Highway were a pleasant relief from the noise that usually filled her mind. The water rolled over her feet, and the backwash pulled the sand beneath her steps back to the ocean. She wished she could tell Colin the truth. She hated keeping so many secrets from him. If only he knew. Then her behavior wouldn't seem strange. But would he believe her even if she did tell him she was a goddess, a daughter of the moon, and that she was here to protect the people from the Atrox, an evil so ancient it had tempted Lucifer into his fall? He'd probably think she'd become a druggie or gone mental. She glanced back at the waves. Colin caught another, then kicked off as the wave broke into the frothy white water. What would he do if she did tell him? It wasn't as if she couldn't prove to him that what she said was true because she also had a gift. She could read minds. She hadn't understood her power when she was little. She only knew then. She only knew then that she was different from everyone else. Sometimes in the excitement of playing, she'd forget her friends weren't speaking and she'd answer their thoughts. Even now, if she became too happy or excited, she'd answer people's thoughts as if they had said them out loud. That was one reason it was difficult to have a boyfriend. It wasn't just Colin who had freaked out the last guy. She'd done a good job of that herself. She had been sitting in his car, listening to him say all these nice things about her. She had nodded her head and said, "Thank you, and I like you too." Then she had looked at his face and known immediately from his puzzled expression that he hadn't uttered a word. She'd been answering his thoughts. It had definitely been bye-bye time after that. She had been too embarrassed to see him again. She still blushed whenever she saw him in the hallway at school. She climbed over barnacle-covered rocks exposed by the low tide and walked around a pile of yellow-brown kelp. The seaweed had washed ashore and now smelled like the fish trapped in its roppy coils and strap-shaped blades. She gazed up at the first quarter moon. She loved the pallid luminescence. She arched her back and slowly opened her arms to receive the moon's light. So much had happened to her. It was still hard to believe. Who she was had remained a mystery to her until she met Maggie Craven, a retired schoolteacher with magic of her own. Tuas dia filia lunia. Lunai. Maggie told her at their first meeting, "You are a goddess, a daughter of the moon." Maggie had explained that in ancient times, when Pandora's box was opened, the last thing to leave the box was hope. Only Selene, the goddess of the moon, saw the demonic creature lurking nearby that had been sent by the Atrox to devour hope. Selene took pity on mankind and gave her daughters, like guardian angels, to perpetuate hope. Perpetuate hope. Perpetuate hope. Perpetuate hope. Serena was one of those daughters. Then Maggie told her about the Atrox. The Atrox and its followers had sworn to destroy the daughters of the moon because once they were gone, the Atrox could bring about the ruin of humankind. The words still stunned her. How many people even believed in mythical world? She had read a few myths in 6th grade, but she didn't think goddesses really existed. And if they did, they wouldn't look like her, funked out in her great-grandmother's pointy-framed sunglasses, a green stud piercing her nose, a stainless steel barbell through her tongue, and a hoop through the skin over her belly button. Maggie had laughed and said people judged too much by looks anyway. It was other things that made a goddess, like magnanimity of spirit, like magnanimity, magnanimity, magnanimity of spirit, courage, and a deep willingness to put one's safety aside to save others. Maggie assured her that Selene had bestowed many gifts upon her, but Serena had a bewildering feeling that a darker goddess had also gifted her. The punkers, who had been bothering Morgan today, were a new kind of followers. They weren't like the ones in Hollywood who tried to conceal their identity. These flaunted their allegiance to the Atrox. They were punks with pierced lips, rat's nest hair, a goat tattooed on their left arm. They used mind control, sucking hope and dreams from their victims. Worse still, they liked blood sports. She asked Maggie about them when she saw her on Thursday. Maggie had become her mentor and guide, and Serene loved her like a grandmother or a favored aunt. Before she met Maggie, she had been like a receptor. receiving random thoughts. Sometimes she went days without hearing anything. Other times it felt like there were three radios turned full blast in her head with everyone's thoughts jumbling inside her. Maggie thought her how Maggie taught her how to go inside a person's mind. It wasn't easy. The first time she tried, she and Maggie had walked over to the Beverly Center. They sat in the food court at the top of the mall, eating California wraps. Maggie pointed to a young boy and told Serena to concentrate, and in her mind's eye to ease her way into the boy's head. She did as Maggie had told her, and suddenly she was inside the boy's thoughts. His mind was cluttered. Baseball, soccer, and video games played around her in a dizzy swirl. Then TV shows, movies, and golden retriever named Harry, just when she wondered if she was going to be lost forever inside the boy's head. She felt Maggie's hand clasp hers, and she was back in the mall, her wrap poised near her mouth. Wow, was all she could say. That's just a tip of the iceberg. Maggie had smiled. Wait till you see what you can do. Even now, when Serena practiced reading a person's mind, she would sometimes get caught in their thoughts like a fly in a gluey spider web in panic, thinking she was going to be trapped forever in another person's physique. Wait. Seethe. Another person's seethe. Maggie thought she had mastered her mind-penetrating skill. Not perfectly, but well enough to go on to the next level of power. Now, Serena was learning how to take a thought and tuck it deep inside a person's mind so they wouldn't remember it. She called it zapping. Serena felt a chill and realized she had been wandering aimlessly down the shore for a long time now, enjoying the phosphorescent beauty of the waves. She hurried to a seawall, climbed it, and looked back. She could no longer see the stretch of highway where they had parked the van. She turned to go back when a wave hit the wall and splashed over her. If she went back the way she had came, the incoming tide would cut her off near the rocks. She didn't want to get caught in an unexpected wave, especially in the dark and fog, so she decided she'd better find a way up the bluffs. By the time she found a path, the fog had pushed into shore, wet and cold. She set down her sandals, untied her sweatshirt, and pulled it over her head. It did little to stop her shivering. Her back ached from the cold, and her bare legs were covered with goosebumps. She trudged slowly up the hiking trail through the chaparral. The scrub oaks took on a twisted, haunted look in the darkness. She walked with care, her uneasiness quickly turning to alarm. She had gone only a little way when she heard a sound as if someone were running in the path ahead of her. The fog was too dense to see. "Hello!" she yelled. She cautiously stepped forward. That's when she heard voices, faint and far away like a church choir, singing. No, more like chanting. She walked quickly now, wanting more than anything to be out of the cold and back in the glare of city lights. Ahead, she could see a glow in the fog and stepped faster. Soon, she could make out the cloudy images of people standing around a fire in a clearing ahead. She couldn't imagine anyone having a campfire party on a cold night like this one, but she was grateful she had found them. Only a few more steps and she could see the fire clearly. With about 30 kids standing in a circle around it, she'd get warm, then ask them the way to the highway. As she walked around the group, no one seemed to notice her. There was a strange tension in the air, as if something important were about to happen. A girl with long blonde hair stood too close to the fire. She wore a low-cut, iridescent black dress. The flowing sleeves reached the tips of her fingers. A gold boa circled her neck, and glittering bracelets curled around her arms. She looked more like she was dressed for a prom than an outdoor party. Flames radiated from the fire and seemed dangerously close to her. Her skirt kept flapping into the blaze. No one seemed alarmed. Then the girl smiled, turned, and stepped into the fire. None of the kids standing near the fire seemed concerned. Were they all blasted on 40s or on high on shrooms? Why wasn't anyone doing anything? Serene dropped her sandals and barreled through the crowd. Her heart raced as adrenaline pumped through her. The girl's dress billowed, then whipped around her as if she had been caught in a maelstrom. In a maelstrom. Flames screamed, wrapped around her long hair, and carried it skyward as a log rolled to the edge of the fire with a hiss. The kids stepped away from the rolling log, but no one made a move to help the girl. Serena was close enough to the raging flames to hear the crackling logs, but she still couldn't feel the heat. She should have been able to feel its warmth by now. And then she saw something that made her stop abruptly. Flames seethed around a girl's arms and face in wild delight. But she wasn't burning. She didn't even look like she was suffering. She looked euro, 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 euphoric, europhic, euro, europhic, euphoric, euphoric, Orphic, whatever, man. Awestruck, Serena stepped closer. Euro, Euro, euphoric. She looked euphoric. Awestruck, Serena stepped closer. It had to be her imagination, but the air seemed colder near the fire. She hesitated, then brushed her hand through the fire. It flared up. Flames licked the tips of her fingers, and it felt like ice. She pulled her hand back and brushed a thin frost from her skin. A cold fire? That was impossible. She stared in wonder at the girl in the inferno. The girl lifted her head to the night sky, spread his arms wide, and smiled. Lecta, 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 lista, 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 lista. The others were chanting. Was that the girl's name? The flames flickered around the girl's face. She inhaled the fire, then opened her eyes. They shone phosphorescent. The blaze screeched into the night sky, and the girl stepped out. Serene felt a thrum against her chest. She didn't need to look down to know her amulet was radiating a white light. Its power was like an invisible wave pushing against her in warning. She took an involuntary step backward and quickly looked around. She had stumbled into a gathering of followers, but they hadn't her amulet warned her earlier, and why weren't they trying to destroy her? They weren't even trying to use their mind control. That's when she saw Carol on the other side of the fire. He smiled at her through the sparking flames. Even at his distance, she felt something creepy about him, the way he looked at her. The last time she had seen him, his mind control had come screeching at her in hellish waves as she faced him in a battle. That was the night Carol, Timmy, and Cassandra had tried to destroy Caddy and Vanessa and steal their powers. She had Jamina and almost been too late to rescue them, but in the end, they had saved the other girls. She turned and bumped into Timmy. He was tall, his hair dyed white blonde, the black roots showing, his lips curved in a crooked sort of way. His nose hoops reflected the orange and red flames. Hey, goddess, he stepped aside. His thin face still looked haunted, but didn't pose a threat. Cassandra stood on the other side of him, her eyes reflecting the fire. She was wearing stretchy black capris under a black tulle shirt and silver-studded cuffs with a black tank top. Thin white scars on her chest made an S, a T, and an A. She had been madly in love with Staten, the leader of the followers, and had tried to slice his name on her chest with a razor blade. Cassandra looked Serena over. Cute outfit, she said sarcastically. Serena glanced at the kids standing around her. They were all dressed as if for prom night. Cassandra gave her another venomous glance. Then her fingers through her maroon-colored hair and stared back at the fire. Serena backed away, more shaken than if Cassandra had slapped her. She felt bewildered. She had battled these people once, so why didn't they challenge her now? Was this some kind of trick, a trap? Then she saw Stanton walking around the fire toward her. He was handsome in a dangerously sexy way in his silk black tuxedo. She knew not to stare into his blue eyes, but there was something compelling that made her eyes linger. Maybe it was the reflection of the fire that made his eyes sparkle with such tenderness. Usually there was a darkness and faraway coldness about them that threatened to drag people into his evil world. Before she was even aware of it, he stood beside her, his eyes inviting and seductive. "I'm glad you came," he said softly, and stroked her hair sensuously. His eyes held hers. It wasn't terrifying, but comforting and lovely. And that was more frightening than if he had tried to push into her mind and control her. Her heart began to race painfully in her chest. She staggered backwards and stood precariously close to the fire. The smoke billowed around her. She breathed it in. The pungent smell made her dizzy and a little sick to her stomach. She grabbed her moon amulet and felt an immediate comfort. Maggie had told her that she would always know intuitively what to do, especially when the moon was full. The moon wasn't full, but at least it wasn't a dark moon, which was when she was most vulnerable. Her powers were weakest during those 3 nights. Then the moon is visible from the earth. She tried to clear her mind to think. She felt like running. A baffled look crossed Stanton's face. "Serena, are you all right? How do you know my name?" she asked, as new apprehension filled her. He had never used her name before. He had always called her Goddess, the way someone spits out the name of an enemy. "You told me," he said, and circled closer to her. He reached out to touch her again when panic took over and she ran. "Serena!" he shouted after her. She crashed through the kids standing near the fire. Stanton kept calling her name. His footsteps pounded the ground behind her. It was dangerous to run so near the edge of the bluffs. She ran away. Terror shuddered through her, and her breath came in rasping draws. Her hands were still quivering, but not from the cold now. She was dripping with perspiration. She tried to think. Most of the followers standing around the fire were probably initiates. Kids who had turned to the Atrox, hoping to be accepted into its congregation. They would want to prove themselves worthy of becoming a follower. They would have some powers of hypnosis, but her skills were far greater than theirs. They would be no threat unless a large group of them caught her. Timmy, Carol, and Cassandra had been accepted by the Atrox and were apprenticed to Stanton, learning to perfect their evil. She might be able to fight them off, but Stanton was another matter. He could read minds, manipulate thoughts, and even imprison people in his memories. She ran more quickly now, arms pumping at her sides. The footsteps behind her were gaining. That was the last thing she remembered. Serena awoke with a start on the beach near the seawall. She looked around her, astonished. A moment ago she had been running on the bluffs above the water, and the next she was on the beach, lying in the sand. "Stanton," she called, with dread. Her hands were shaking, and she felt unbearably cold. When he hadn't answered her, she stood slowly, feeling dazed. She looked in the wet sand. She saw only her own footprints. Could she have fallen asleep and dreamed about the cold fire? She didn't remember resting or even sitting down. She lifted her hand to brush back the hair hanging in her eyes and felt a sharp pain. Her palms were raw and scratched. She stepped down to the water and let a wave wash over them. The salt water stung. Could she have fallen over the bluff, tried to grab a hold of something, then slipped and lost consciousness when she hit the sand? She started walking down the beach. After some distance, she heard music coming from Colin's van radio. Relief flowed through her. Never had as an irritating, bad to the bone surf guitar music sounded so heavenly. She turned toward the music and ran up the sand, kicking through discarded cans and the charcoal remains of a long-ago beach fire. Strong hands grabbed her. She let out a startled cry. "Serena!" Colin said in a bewildered voice. His flashlight shone on her in her eyes, then away. "Where have you been?" What do you mean? Why did you stop surfing so early? He pushed his waterproof glow-in-the-dark watch in front of her. She stared down at the face of the watch in disbelief. 2 hours had passed since the sun had set and she'd left Colin. I've been looking for you for almost an hour, he scolded. She continued to stare at the watch. What happened to you? He took off his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body heat, and she gratefully snuggled into it. You're shivering, and what? She tried to push into his hand to see what he was seeing, but her own mind felt sluggish. How'd you break your glasses? She took them off the top of her head. The lens was missing from the right side. I don't know. She hated the tremble of fear that had crept into her words. What do you mean you don't know? She shrugged. Did you fall on the rocks? She shook her head even though she knew he couldn't see her in the dark. You didn't try to climb up the cliff, did you? He asked. Maybe. She tried to force herself to remember. I must have fallen. You know how dangerous that is? He sounded really upset. They walked back toward the van in silence, following the bobbing beam of his flashlight. Soon, streetlights from the highway cast a dim light over the beach. Finally, she was able to steady herself enough to speak without the strange twitch in her words. I don't know what had happened, she said. I thought I was on top of the bluffs, but then I woke up in the sand like I had fallen asleep. He opened the van door and the dome light came on. She glanced up and saw the worry on Colin's face. She wondered what he was seeing on her own face, because he held her hands tightly. Are you sure you're all right? And in the same breath he said, you're lucky paramedics aren't scraping you off the rocks. He opened her hands and looked at the palms. They were scratched, as if she had fallen and tried to grab hold of something. She closed her hands into fists. Let's go out of here, she said, and slipped into the passenger side of the utility van. She pressed her bare feet into the carpet. What had happened to her blue sandals? She touched the top of her head and squinted, trying to remember. It only made her feel dizzy. The fire seemed hazy now, like a dream. The more she tried to pull into it focus, the more it drifted away. Serena, she became aware then that Colin had been talking to her. Do you want to go to the hospital? No, she said. Sure. Yeah. She felt his hand touch her head, and then she looked at the tips of his fingers. A single drop of blood sat on the top of his index finger. You must have hit your head, he said. Maybe we should go to the hospital. I'm fine. She tried to sound convincing as she pulled down the mirror on the visor. She examined the small scrape. It's not deep. Promise me that you'll stay away from the bluffs, he said. I promise. But she didn't think she had fallen. She would remember slipping, trying to hold on. The free fall? Home? He asked. The concern in his eyes made her feel guilty. Yeah, turn on the heat, she said, and pulled a seatbelt around her. She hated the unclear feeling inside her head. She clasped her arms around her for warmth. Even the familiar smells of surf wax, zinc oxide, and suntan oil didn't comfort her the way they normally do. In the wood. Put it down. Even the familiar smell. Wait. See? She wanted to be away from this beach that had once been such a place of solace. Colin jumped behind the wheel and turned on the engine, then the heater. She turned and looked toward the cliffs, hoping to see the faint glow from the fire through the fog. She didn't see anything. Maybe Colin was right. Maybe she had fallen. He pulled into the fog-locked traffic and turned the music higher. By the time they merged onto the Santa Monica freeway, her heart rhythm had returned to normal. How was it? She asked finally. The skeg was humming, he said. A skeg was the tail of the surfboard, and humming was the whistle the skeg made, cutting at high speed through the water. Her mind felt less fuzzy now, and she gently pushed into Colin's mind to see if he had seen anything that might give her a clue about what had happened. She didn't find anything unusual, but twice he glanced at her as if he could feel her sorting through his thoughts. What would he do if he found out she could read his mind? So that is chapter 1 and chapter 2. The 2 chapters read by Larissa Browen. I'm going to stop it at that. And I am going to take a break and drink some of this delicious water. H2O. So, and then I'll make a new video starting on the chapter 3 since the setting is really nice and my eyes look wonderful, and no matter how my hair looks, my eyes hit the focus. Anyways, have a great day. See you.